The people who arrived on the shores of the New World came from many places. They came for many reasons, and most of them brought with them traditions of Christian faith that had been practiced in Europe for centuries. But an interesting thing happened once these new arrivals settled down in this vast and fertile land. The regulation of religious practices that had long been controlled by kings and governments in Europe was now up for grabs. Over time, these people of faith created something in America that had never been seen in the history of the world. They created a nation where this religious freedom gave birth to unprecedented levels of religious diversity, experimentation, and competition among churches and religious groups. These spiritual pioneers laid the foundation for a spiritually diverse new world, where faith and practice were no longer controlled by monarchs, but by common, everyday men and women.
The genius of religion in the 17th century and throughout American history is that people of faith were able to lift up motivations that were less than glamorous, quite mundane, colonizing, looking for new resources, looking for a path to the east. These considerations were not necessarily religious, but the Puritans and also Catholic missionaries in the 17th and 18th century took ordinary concerns and pursuits and put them in the context of eternity.
Christianity came to North America in waves, as group after group left the problems of the old world for the hope of a better life in the new. In the first wave, Columbus and other Catholic explorers colonized the New World for Spain and the Pope. The first explorers arrived in the Caribbean, but in 1513 they landed in Florida, and soon growing numbers of Catholic missionaries would be working in areas that would become the United States. In the second wave, Anglican colonists from England established the Jamestown colony in 1607. This was the first permanent English settlement in the New World. In the third wave, the Pilgrims, who were actually Protestant separatists from Britain, France, and Ireland, who were persecuted for breaking with the established church back home, came to Plymouth Rock in 1620 to create a brave new experiment in self-government. They spelled out their goals in the Mayflower Compact.
Having undertaken, for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith and honor of our King and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents solemnly and mutually, in the presence of God and one of another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic, for our better ordering and preservation, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience.
The Mayflower Compact and most of the New England documents, in a sense, set up that part of the country very well, and still has an influence, because they really said, what do you do in a covenant or a compact? It's vertical. God says and we respond. We should see ourselves as pilgrims. They called themselves that, and they took precedence from how God had dealt with pilgrim people in the past.
But the Pilgrims weren't the last wave of newcomers. French Catholics first arrived in North America in the 1500s and continued to arrive centuries later. And in the late 18th century, Russian Orthodox priests established missions in Alaska. Taken together, these various waves of Christian immigrants from various faith traditions and various parts of the world would create a land of unprecedented religious diversity. At first, the various groups of British immigrants created their own independent colonies where the faith traditions developed over centuries in Europe continued to exert a powerful force over the daily life and religious practices of the colonists.
The tradition that had emerged in Europe was one of state churches, established churches. The Landeskirche, if you're putting it in German, you had a church attached to a territory. Now, the inception of this was the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, where they came up with a rule in Latin, cuius regio eius religio. It basically means the religion of the prince is the religion of the kingdom. So you have a dominant, settled official church.
Virginia was an Anglican colony whose members remained faithful to the English or Episcopalian Church, even when American patriots began urging independence from the motherland. Massachusetts was a Puritan colony. Its members wanted to reform the Anglican faith in the New World. Maryland was founded as a Catholic colony. Catholics who had suffered persecution from Anglicans in England sought to live out their faith in their small, struggling colony.
The vast majority, 90% plus, would say that they were Christians. Many colonists, even if they didn't go to church, would read their Bible. If they owned a book, it would be the Bible. It's a highly biblically literate culture that they live in. But if you're talking about institutional religion, the presence of churches in the colonies is often surprisingly low. I mean, especially the further south you go.
Over time, these various immigrant groups who brought their faith from the old country, America became a religious place and eventually a nation from the very beginning in the 1620s and thereafter, because the people who settled this country had a genius for framing questions in religious terms, in the scale of eternity.
Smaller groups of believers came to America too, like the Quakers, who settled in Pennsylvania, which was founded by Quaker leader William Penn. Quakers suffered horrible persecution in England, so when they came to America, they determined to create a haven for religious freedom. Among the other groups who settled in Pennsylvania were Lutherans from Germany, the Amish and other Mennonite groups from Germany and Switzerland, Presbyterians from Scotland and Northern Ireland, as well as German Calvinists.
The general situation in the colonies was, I think, migrating toward more toleration, more space to exercise religion, but by no means did there exist a formal or an agreed upon understanding that the best situation for religion was to have no government supervision.
Most of the early New World colonies had an officially sanctioned church affiliation. But following the Revolution of 1776 and America's Declaration of Independence, a new nation was created and history was made. The United States of America would be the first nation in the history of the world based on the concept of religious freedom.
Almost everybody thought the state should have some role in religion. There were two groups that were opposed to that idea. A semi-secular group, we could think of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who thought as a matter of principle that the churches should not have anything to do with the state. And on the other side were the Baptists, who felt that it was damaging for the faith in groups like the Baptists, and they too wanted complete separation. Most Americans were in the middle. They knew that there couldn't be a hard and fast church establishment like the Europeans had practiced, but they also knew that religion was important for public life. So there are many proposals, maybe collecting taxes from everybody and then distributing them to the churches that people chose, and other proposals were made for addressing the situation. But what finally developed by the 1790s, 1800s, in almost all of the states, there was rapid movement toward a voluntary support for religion, what we now know as the separation of church and state.
Freedom of religion was enshrined in the first of the 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, known as the Bill of Rights.
Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances,
Baptist preachers are being thrown in jail in Virginia in the early 1770s for illegal preaching. And this is part of the reason why James Madison and Thomas Jefferson get so interested in the issue of religious liberty, is they say this is ridiculous. The state shouldn't be involved in this kind of thing. Partly because they know, especially Jefferson knows, that if the state's persecuting evangelicals, they're going to come for him next.
The Bill of Rights is set apart from other governing documents in a couple of senses. One is that it enumerates a set of rights. That was a rather unusual thing to do. The second is that the rights that it enumerates are primarily rights as immunities. That means there are things government cannot do to you. Government is not permitted to do. So the primary thrust of the Bill of Rights is not to say government has to do this for us, it's to say government is not permitted to do these things. It cannot encroach in certain ways. So it's designed quite specifically to limit the power of government.
In 1831, a French thinker and historian named Alexis de Tocqueville toured America. His observations about the new nation's individualism and religiosity took center stage in his classic book, Democracy in America.
Americans of all ages, all conditions, and all dispositions constantly form associations. The Americans make associations to found seminaries, to construct churches, to diffuse books, to send missionaries. In this manner, they found hospitals, prisons, and schools. Perhaps there is no country in the world where fewer idle men are to be met with than in America.
De Tocqueville was amazed by an American nation where freedom, individualism, and faith combined to form a potent powerhouse of energy and activity.
God wants to be loved. It's a very loathsome image of God if you think that you have to impose and coerce God. And so the founders, I think, by saying we're going to be Christian by winning individuals, by winning groups, my simple line is coercion or voluntary. Law is always coercive and forces faith. Voluntary is very effective.
Churches in the United States have tended to be faiths that argue about what you can do positive in your life. They are formulas for activism, to get people busy doing things in this world. They build institutions that carry out all kinds of activities that go beyond a simple come to church and pray and listen to the sermon. I think the idea of a consumer-driven religion emerges as soon as you tell churches they have to make it on their own. It's a radical idea. The notion that you could have something deemed to be important to the general public good, religion. And everyone in the late 18th century in the United States would have concurred in that proposition. You need religion to make a democratic republic work. But once you take away tax money, then you have to find another way to operate. There were some churches that didn't make that adjustment, and they became small denominations. Those were the churches that were the most used to getting tax money during the colonial period. But the churches who rapidly made the adjustment, and in the Protestant tradition that was the Methodist and the Baptist, they quickly took religion and sold it.
One of the best examples of religious freedom in the marketplace of ideas can be seen in the hard-working circuit riders who made Methodism the largest denomination in America by the 19th century. Methodist founder, Englishman John Wesley, started out as an Anglican who wanted to reform the Church of England. But in time, Methodists would break away from the Anglican Church altogether. In America, evangelists like Francis Asbury helped make Methodism the largest denomination in the U.S. by the mid-1800s.
The circuit riders were Methodist preachers, and they were different from preachers in colonial America in that they didn't minister to a single congregation in a single community. What they did instead is they wrote a circuit. And by the early 1800s, the standard circuit had become a 4-week circuit. In other words, a circuit that took 4 weeks to ride around, generally about 400 miles in length, with preaching appointments every day, or virtually every day. So you would have 25 to 30 preaching appointments per round. This was a very effective system for reaching a rapidly expanding rural population, because obviously the minister didn't just preach on Sunday. These Methodist preachers preached every day. A typical day for a circuit rider, they would get up in the morning, they would ride to their next appointment, then they would meet small groups, class meetings, and other groups in the afternoon. They would preach in the evening. Then they would go home with a local family who would feed them and give them a place to sleep for the night. And they would get up and they would do it all again the next day. Circuit riders allowed Methodism, and I think to a large degree American evangelicalism, to keep up with the expansion of the American population and the size of the country. If they hadn't been there, a lot of communities would not have been able to attract or support a preacher, a minister. But the fact that circuit riders could minister to literally 24 or more congregations each allowed them to reach a lot more people. And I think it's largely because of things like Methodist circuit riders that American religious adherence, the proportion of people attending churches in America, actually doubled between the Revolution and the Civil War.
Today, megachurches like Willow Creek, located in the upscale suburbs of Chicago, illustrate the continuing power of America's marketplace approach to religion. Willow Creek has long been one of the biggest churches in America. Today, 20,000 people attend its weekly services. And its Willow Creek Association has more than 5,000 member churches around the country that follow the church's model, which uses contemporary music, accessible mini-dramas, and sermons that focus on how faith can help people be more successful parents, workers, and citizens. But what impact has this approach had on America's theology?
Think of megachurches. We also have in mind a church that has a dynamic and visionary pastor and leadership team that has a very carefully thought through evangelism and discipleship program. Usually megachurches have a lot of small groups, sometimes interest-based groups. Most American megachurches have had a seeker orientation, that is, trying to draw in the unchurched and not just provide more churchly-like services for people that are going to be one place or another anyway. Most people, regardless of what they think in general, would say, well, they're at least trying to take seriously mainstream culture. They're trying to take seriously the busyness of people who aren't going to be ordinarily getting up to go to church on Sunday. They're trying to meet people's needs. They're trying to be relevant to people. And they want to reach the unchurched, people who aren't going to be there otherwise. And unless a church is just anti-evangelism or anti-growth, whatever you think of their methods, they're at least giving it a try, and they're trying to be innovative about that. And so I should think that's something of a challenge to other churches that maybe are a little more lethargic or happy to just have the same old families, the same old people involved. The organizational or sociological or even theological challenge or possible problems with megachurches are whether they contribute to the redefinition of Christianity as a consumer commodity. This is something that people might consume in their lives if it makes them happy, if it puts them in groups that they're comfortable with, if it meets their needs. Most people in American Christianity historically think of Christianity as a commodity you purchase and consume for your satisfaction. And yet, in their sort of packaging of Christianity for Americans, megachurch culture seems to lean in that direction. We're here to meet your needs. We're not going to be too demanding. So that's one problem. Another problem, I would say, is megachurches probably contribute yet another step to the fragmentation, the disunity of the American church.
It's a long way from Plymouth Rock to Willow Creek, but the goal of Christian history is to help people of faith make connections between the ways people of faith live out their beliefs today and the ways they did so in earlier times.
When surveys ask people, do you believe in God? Usually you have 90% or so of Americans say that they do believe in God. Now I realize that many of the people who say they believe in God probably do not attend church, and a significant number of them, in fact, are hostile to organized religion. Nonetheless, compared to Western Europe, whether you're talking about Germany or Great Britain or France, in the American context, a significant higher number of Americans actually attend church. So in order to understand Americans as citizens, as voters, in terms of their seeking a place of meaning, in terms of their worshiping of God and so on, it's absolutely vital to study American religion and church history in order to get a better sense of Americans themselves.
The Catholic Church in the 1950s and 60s was sort of defined as God, Pope, bishops, priests, and then there were those funny people out here called the laity. They wanted to change that. Their theology was to change it. So they turned to church history. What did they do? They said, let's call ourselves the people of God. They hadn't done that for centuries. It really changed things. Or they said, let's call ourselves the Pilgrim Church instead of the Triumphant Church, or the Servant Church instead of the slave-making church. They drew on these options. And I think almost all renewals of the church mean that somebody goes back and asks, how did they face that before? The Iron Curtain falls. How did people do when the Romans persecuted Christians, etc.? It's very practical. You can't invent this out of nowhere. You have to have models, and we get that from history.
My own sense is that there are several good reasons for a continuing interest in the past amongst the Christian faithful, not the experts, but just ordinary laymen and laywomen. And first is an understanding of the scriptures. The Bible is central to all Christian groups. Reading the Bible, understanding the Bible, interpreting the Bible, putting the Bible to use, all of these are central to Christian life. The Bible has been important for the churches since the beginning, and the ways in which people have approached the Bible, understood the Bible, applied the Bible can help us in the present. The second way I think is important is to understand the world. Christian life is always about faithful people in environments, in culture, in society. And one of the dramatic things that one sees in the history of Christianity is the many different approaches that have been taken to putting Christian truth to practice in the churches. So studying the Middle Ages when the churches were in control, studying some of the newer Christian regions in the world where the churches have never been in control, gives perspective to people who might have some position in society, might not have any position in society. A third way is to understand that the church exists by God's grace. One thing historians are pretty good at finding out is all the times that Christian people and Christian organizations have screwed up. And they've screwed up a lot. There's been a lot of damage done to the Christian faith by Christian churches, but the fact that Christianity continues in many varieties, many forms, many shapes, many parts of the world is a good indication that behind the Christian church is the Christian God.
The past never exactly matches the present. But if we learn how to look for trends and connections between them, we can gain insight about who we are and the challenges we face.
Christians don't have an identity without their history. In order to understand generations of fidelity to the gospel, to Jesus Christ, it's necessary to understand history. What you're presenting in Christian history is the sense that this is a long story, and Christians have had this argument, this civil conversation about the meaning of Jesus, the meaning of the good, how we ought to live for over 2,000 years. And this locates people in a larger than life story, and a story that's bigger than their own lifetime and their own particular concerns. It ennobles them, it gives them a sense of identity, time, place, and a trajectory to their lives and their connectedness with generations of people who follow Jesus Christ.
While history isn't the cure for all of the challenges we face, and there is no guarantee that we will agree on what history is teaching us, if we don't try to learn from the past, we will be lost as we head into the future. So we hope you'll come along with us through this series as we look at the factors and forces that have made American Christians a unique people of faith.